Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Marlon Moore. I am president of Marlon Moore Consulting based here in Columbus, Ohio, and I will be moderating our panel conversation today. As we begin, take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Share your name and what state you're joining us from. That will be very helpful for us to know who's taking time out to be a part of today's discussion. As you all know, equity is one of the most pressing issues impacting classroom instruction. Educators must ensure that all students have access to the same educational opportunities, regardless of their background or identity. Today, we have brought together a group of experts to share their thoughts on equity in this classroom. And we're so glad that they've taken time to join us. But before we dive into content, I'd like to share with you a few tips on how to maximize your webinar experience. Just a few tips for you to remember. Please join in the conversation. We'd like to hear your story, and you can ask questions by engaging with fellow participants and subject matter experts. Our panelists and Project Lead the Way team members are available to answer questions during the webinar. So if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A tab. If you have a question, submit it through the Q&A tab and not the group chat, okay? So if you have a question, we'll hope to get to those, submit them in the Q&A tab and not the group chat. Now is a good time to review some of the technical aspects of our presentation. So check your audio settings on your computer as well as your speaker volumes if you're having any trouble. If you're still having issues, there's a detailed audio troubleshooting file. It's available as a resource under the Q&A window. For some reason, if your console freezes or you hear music after the presentation has begun, please take a moment to refresh your browser. There are also other icons that open up some additional feature panels in our webinar console. For example, you can read about today's speakers. Their bios are included there. You can click the resource list to download a copy of any slides that you see today, contact information, or just join the group chat. You can also follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag #EWWebinar. So again, we're so glad that you have taken the time to join us. We want to thank our panelists. You'll see their names listed here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to share your stories and share best practices. So let's have some fun today, you all. Let's get into it and hear from the experts on this topic. And I'll ask each panelist to please briefly introduce yourself. And we'll just start with the first question. I'd like for you to answer the first question during your introduction. And that is simply, from your perspective, what is the impact of equity, or what is the impact if equity isn't addressed for middle school teachers, classrooms, and students? From your perspective, what is the impact if we don't address equity for our middle school teachers, classrooms, and students? And so I'd like to start with Dr. Catherine Kennedy. Catherine, if you'd like to take a first pass at that, that would be great. Just need to unmute yourself and we can hear you in 1 second. Not as of yet. Not now, but we'll give it another 15 seconds or so. And if we have to come back to you, we can, but still no sound. Okay. So we'll come back to Dr. Kennedy. So Bonnie Garrett, if you're there, Bonnie Garrett, Project Lead the Way master teacher out of Huntsville City Schools. Bonnie, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. If you don't mind, I'll put the question to you from your perspective. What is the impact if equity is not addressed for middle school teachers, classroom, and students? And so please share a little bit about yourself for our audience today as well.
All right, will do. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Bonnie Garrett, and I'm a Milken National Educator from Huntsville, Alabama, with 22 years of STEM teaching experience. So in thinking about what the impact would be if equity is not addressed in the classroom, I'll tell you that the early years of my teaching career afforded me the opportunity to experience teaching in the classroom in which I did not address equity. And it wasn't intentional, but this impacted my classroom in three ways. One, it created frustration for all parties involved, me and the students. Two, it increased the sense of inadequacy for my students. And three, there was no true mastery of content. So, like I said, I didn't do this knowingly. I just didn't realize it until I had this one particular class where I had 44 students in this class, 20 general ed students, 24 collaborative students. And they were frustrated because they did not understand the information that I was teaching. And I was frustrated because I didn't understand why they didn't understand what I was teaching. So it forced me to have to analyze my classroom. And when I began to think about my classroom and what I was doing or was not doing, I had to figure out how to make my teaching style beneficial to the students. And that made me realize that I had to know what my students' needs were in order to be able to make them feel successful in the classroom and to allow them to be successful. So once I began to understand the needs of my students, that kind of allowed me to hone in on my teaching style and the supports and resources that my students needed for success. And along with their successes came mastery of content. And along with the mastery of the content came a diminished amount of frustration for all parties involved, which made me feel better about it. So that experience prompted me to be more intentional about becoming an equity literate educator. And that transformation was instrumental in my quest to be a truly effective educator. So.
That's excellent. Bonnie, thank you so much for what you do. And I really love the fact that you recognize the opportunity to adjust your learning style based on the audience and reaching the audience in front of you. So congratulations and thank you again for all you do. Look forward to hearing more from you later.
Yes, sir.
So let's check back in with Dr. Catherine Kennedy. Catherine, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, and apologies for the technology snafu.
No
thanks
worries.
so much, Dr. Moore, for leading this conversation, and to PLTW for the opportunity to be here with these inspiring colleagues, and to all of you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Catherine Kennedy, and I have two primary passions I've been cultivating for over 15 years. On the mental health side, I serve as founder and executive director of Wellness for Educators. We're a 501c3 nonprofit invested in and passionate about creating school-wide wellness through mind-body education and practices for school leaders, educators, students, and parents and guardians. And on the digital and online learning side, I created an education consulting firm called Consult for Ed Group. So Dr. Moore, your question, I think, is a timely one. I believe we are already seeing the beginning impact of equity not being addressed in schools. When we think about equity in our work at Wellness for Educators, for instance, we are thinking about the well-being of and equity for students as we work to support educators, noting that the education system is imbalanced and not always meeting educators' needs in equitable ways, nor students as well. So pre-pandemic for educators, we saw 30% of them leaving the profession. But during the pandemic, and even more so now, we are seeing over 50% of educators choosing to leave to preserve their own well-being. And an even higher rate of attrition is seen for educators of color and for those who are identifying as LGBTQIA+, which leads to a lack of representation for our students of color and those in LGBTQIA+ community. So we are also seeing students and their parents choosing alternatives to traditional schools. For instance, the vice chair of our board of Wellness for Educators is named Shamari Jones. He is the director of equity and strategic engagement at Bellevue School District in the state of Washington. And he was sharing with me that a week ago, he was working with other district leaders, dealing with whole school closures and building consolidations because of overwhelming educator and student shortages. And a lot of it had to do with equity, specifically for his team. So there are ways I think we can work to shift this tide, and I think that's why we're here today to talk about those strategies that classroom teachers and educators in general can employ for that.
That's great, Catherine. Thank you so much for bringing that point of view into the discussion. Just want to acknowledge Project Lead the Way and Ed Week for putting on today's webinar, because you bring up a good point as well of how can we support educators and their well-being in this time of opportunity. And so hopefully we'll definitely, I'm sure, we'll provide some thoughts and strategies today to support them as well on this journey. So thank you so much for being here. And so next we will go to, for our panel discussion, Sanal Bhakta. Sanal, are you there?
I'm here, Marlon. How are you doing today?
I'm phenomenal. Sanal, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for being here today. And so if you don't mind, I'll just take a brief second to just revisit the question. What is the impact if equity is not addressed for middle school teachers, classrooms, and students? And by all means, please take a moment to share with our audience a little bit about yourself.
All right, thank you. My name is Sanal Bhakta. I work for Clark County School District. We are the 5th largest school district in the country. I support 50 high schools, 60 middle schools, all across the county. And I primarily work in the Career and Tech Ed office. So one of the things that we've always focused on in CTE or Career Tech Ed is, ensuring when students do leave education, they leave prepared to be successful, no matter what their choice is. And really what equity is for middle grades, right? I'll say middle grades, like 5th through 9th grade. It's that health check, that wellness check, that mental check around, are we reaching all students? Are we making sure all students have the access, the resources available to them to be successful? Are they aware of all the opportunities available to them? I've been really passionate about this space. About 8 years ago with our district, I started our Girls in STEM, Girls in Tech initiative to really help focus the efforts on our female students in those middle grades to ensure they had all the opportunities, they had all the access as other students did. And really, the student's journey is the key, and that in middle school, that's that wellness check that I mentioned. That's when it's our responsibility as educators to ensure, are we doing everything we can? Are we providing all the necessary support, resources, opportunities to those students? There's a lot of challenges out there in the education system in general, but I think focusing on, just kind of that check to make sure that, we are reaching everyone. Not only are we being equitable, but it's that equity focus, that ensuring that we're being diverse, we're being inclusive, and we're providing that access to all those students.
That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. Thank you, Sanal. Appreciate all that you do, and we're so excited to hear more from you later. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. And our next panelist is Dr. Portia Newman. Dr. Portia Newman, so great to see you.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I know you've heard the question 3 different times, but all right, in the spirit of learning, and listening, I'll just go ahead and repeat it really quickly. From your perspective, what is the impact if we don't address equity for middle school teachers, classrooms, and students?
Well, Marlon, there's no issue with repeating the question. I think it's helpful for learners and for the folks on this call. But let me start by saying thank you for that question. Thank you for this opportunity. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to join this panel for a number of reasons, but mainly because it's so timely, given our socio-political climate and the transition in and through this pandemic. I'm Dr. Portia Newman, affectionately known as Dr. Portia, if you will. I'm the founder of PN Consulting, based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and coming to this work with a heart for learning, and specifically thinking about that in terms of people and impact. I do this work in partnership with adults who serve our young people in many capacities. I'm an educator who's transitioned my skills and my work experience into tech and now into healthcare. And I'm really focused on how we center equity and reposition ourselves to advocate for equity in our processes and our best practices, and while supporting the implementation of this, and in this case, in school spaces. So we all know, how we define equity, really thinking about those individual needs of students and families, and what it takes for teachers to have the right tools and knowledge, right, to support that learning and the development of students. But when this question raises for me kind of a deep charge, if you will. And I think that is more about really understanding the deep impact that it would have if we didn't address equity for middle school teachers in our classrooms and with students. If it's not addressed, y'all, we fail our students. We continue to perpetuate systems of inequity that have historically created barriers for students and families, and specifically those who are kind of at the middle of that intersectionality with multiple identities, and that prevents them from being successful. And thinking about what it would mean if we didn't address equity, it also makes me think about how we would miss out on the community cultural wealth of those students and those families and those contributions to the learning space. That is also true for our teachers and other educator staff in the building. And then it also makes me think about how it would limit those possibilities for inclusive learning and collaboration, all skills we need outside of the classroom. And that would ultimately reflect what opportunities and dreams our students have. So I do think there's a big many implications, for what that could look like in our classrooms.
That's awesome. Thank you, Portia, for all you do and continue to keep up the great work. And I want to thank all of our panelists so much for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with the audience. Again, before we dive into specific questions, thank you all for taking time to join us. Our participants, put your name in the chat, the state you're from. If you have questions, you can add them and you can go to the Q&A tab and add your questions there. We're going to do our very best to get to as many of those as possible. But during this portion of the discussion, we're going to dive into some specific questions. We've structured this webinar to start at the individual level, individual person, then we'll move into the classroom, and then we'll talk about the curriculum in the wider school district. And so we want to look at the individual level, moving into the classroom as we talk about strategies, and then things you can think about from a curriculum perspective at the wider school and district level. And so with that, we're going to start with Catherine. I want to ask you at the individual level, what individuals can do specifically to impact equity in the middle school classroom. And so with that, sort of as a backdrop, Catherine, why is mental health and wellness so important for individual educators and students?
Thanks for that question, Dr. Moore. And Dr. Portia, I'm so glad that you brought up what you brought up during your comment, because I think that the sociopolitical issues that we're seeing today can lead to prolonged stress and trauma for our educators and students. And I think that has a huge impact on equity in our classrooms and for the stakeholders. So in our work at Wellness for Educators, we talk a lot about the intersection of prolonged stress, trauma, and learning. And trauma is anything that puts us outside of our ability to cope. And that comes from Dr. Peter Levine, who's a trauma expert. The space in which we are able to cope is called our window of tolerance. And that is how much stress we are able to tolerate until we are pushed outside of that window into our inability to cope. So when we experience trauma and prolonged stress and we don't have the time or take the time to heal it, our bodies and minds store it, which can cause our nervous systems to go into unregulated spaces, such as fight, flight, fawn, and or freeze responses. And brain research shows that in those spaces, no new learning can take place. So if we're not working our way through and healing our prolonged stress or trauma, we can get to the point where we are unable to learn in meaningful ways. So we're all familiar with the notion of, or saying that we can push through or go back to normal. And I think that sort of sentiment circulated a lot during the pandemic, but we can't push through or go back to normal because one, the system wasn't serving everyone equitably at that time anyway. And two, when we push through and go back to normal, we are actively suppressing these trauma and prolonged stress experiences and the emotions that accompany those experiences, which, as the ACEs study shows, they only come back up later for us in physical and mental ailments. So this is why we place so much emphasis in our work on the need for healing and to create equitable spaces. And that healing process cannot just be cognitive based only. It also has to be body-based healing, because trauma and prolonged stress are not only stored in our minds, but they're also stored in our physical bodies.
Wow, that's powerful, Catherine. So To that point in your intro, you mentioned that the work you do is focused on whole school wellness. It's making sense to me at this moment. So, can you share a little bit more about that whole school wellness?
For sure, for sure. So there's a lot of emphasis in the field about educators needed to take care of themselves, right? Or even students to take care of themselves. And our board chair, Dr. Mayruji Duni, who is a licensed psychologist at the Momentous Institute based in Dallas, shared some stats from the 2021 RAND Corporation study at one of our board meetings recently. And this study was focused on the state of the US teacher, and research revealed that 1 in 4 teachers indicated that they were likely to leave the profession by the end of the year. And that is up from 1 in 6 pre-pandemic. So a quarter of the teachers in 2021 said that they were ready to leave. And then in 2023, they're even saying that it's a harder year yet that they've ever faced. 50% of teachers who self-identified as Black or African American reported they were likely to leave. 75% of teachers report that they have frequent job-related stress, and that's up 61% since pre-pandemic. So that's a huge shift that we're seeing. 75% of teachers are saying that they're experiencing high levels of stress. 20% of them are saying that they don't know how to cope with it. And about 50% are reporting feeling burned out, and 25% are saying that they have symptoms of depression. And these are statistics that we cannot ignore anymore. While self-care can be a remedy for stress and burnout, self-care cannot be the one and only solution for what has become more of a systemic problem, back to what Dr. Portia was saying, for our schools and our communities. And so the stress that's being experienced by our educators, while it's being experienced on an individual level, the issue is a systemic one. So we have to take into account what is happening around our educators, with other people, and within the school district and community at large. And one of my teachers said, Dr. Albert Wong, he says, challenges within communities or systems need interventions at the level of communities or systems. And there needs to be an awareness of those challenges, and then an action to actually alleviate them. So to that end, we have to look at ways that the structures, the systems, the resources, and the supports need to change in order to be more equitable and best bolster not only educators, but the other stakeholders within the systems. And that includes students, parents, and guardians, who subsequently also contribute to educator well-being. So it needs to be more of a community-based whole school approach where everyone is on the same page, rather than everybody just taking care of themselves in an individual approach. And this is also important because we feel that whatever is how we feel is being transferred not only from within, but also to our students and colleagues around us. So by approaching this from a collective care and whole school approach, we can then be compassionate and empathetic with others and their behaviors, because behaviors can communicate stress responses to something that a person is experiencing. And if you think about it, most of our school systems were not built with this community-based support approach in mind. It was more industrial revolution focused and preparing individuals to enter the workforce. And schools were also starting in a time when there's a huge stigma around mental health and well-being. And while we're making strides to kind of break that stigma, we still have a lot of work to do in that area. But cultivating that culture of collective care, where everyone is focused on community-based whole school wellness, is essential to being equitable for educators as well as all of the other stakeholders within that learning, teaching, and leading space.
Wow, those were some powerful statistics, Catherine. I want to move on to our other panelists in just one second, but I must get back to you. So I want you to think about this question as I come back later. If those are some of the challenges that our educators are facing, how do we support our students in the challenges that they're dealing with? So just hold parking lot that, and we'll circle back in a moment. But thank you so much. And I'd like to take this moment now, Bonnie, I want to shift to you. We heard some really, Dr. Kennedy provided some really eye-opening remarks, but we'd like to get your perspective as a classroom teacher. what do you do in your classroom, specific strategies to ensure equity?
Awesome. Well, thank you for that question, and definitely for Dr. Catherine and Dr. Portia. Their comments kind of hone in on my personal take in my classroom. You know, Dr. Catherine said the culture of collective care, and Dr. Portia talking about, you know, it being a work of the heart. So when I introduced myself, I talked about analyzing my class to kind of figure out where my students were. So that kind of had a personal hold on it for me, because when I started teaching, the students that I was teaching were the same age as my baby sister at that time, which is 13, or then it was. So I knew the struggles that she had in school because she would tell me about them, and I knew how to help her because I knew and I understood her and how she processed information. So that idea, that whole concept kind of resonated with me, and I began to kind of look at my students in the same light, and I still do to this day. So I realized that I could help them in the same manner that I helped my baby sister if I got to know my students and their learning styles. So this helped me to understand that building relationships with my students readily lended itself to ensuring equity in my classroom. Because if I spend some time getting to know my students, then the first couple of weeks, I facilitate lessons that let me get to know them, and I call these my all about me activities and strategies. And like I said, they help me to learn my students and give me the opportunity for them to learn a little more about me. It's because I model the activities that I do with them and the strategies. And in addition to these types of activities, the concepts that we focus on in my classroom, because I do STEM-based classes, it really provides a framework for ensuring equity, because most of the students' work is project or performance-based, which taps into what they already know or what they don't know. And this allows them to build on what they do know or don't know through the learning process. So it's scaffolding at its finest display once you look at it from that perspective. It allows your students to know that the classroom is a safe place for their learning processes in order for them to truly be open to the learning process. And that's why building those relationships are essential, because if they feel comfortable enough with that, then they will allow the learning to take place and they won't feel like they are at a deficit. Excuse me. So like I said, this is when students realize that you have their best interest at heart and mind, then they understand that you are going to be vested in their interests and in their successes inside and outside the classroom. And so with this kind of concept in mind, it helps them also to understand that for me and in my classroom, failure is not an option. It's not one that we choose to address, because they understand that since I have their best interests at heart, that I'm not going to settle for anything less than their best efforts. And their best efforts possibly have been equitable in my teaching practices, then they can kind of reach those goals. So that's kind of how I put my spin on it in my classroom, to kind of try to address equity and do those strategies. Let the learning be as natural as possible to them, and just meet them where they are and take them from that point forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Bonnie. Thank you so much. When I think about equity, I think about access. What supports my learning style? How comfortable am I in being myself? Are my instructors willing to reach me and adapt and adjust to my learning style? All of those things, all working towards building this psychological and mental space to become my best self as a student and as a person. When you think about that work, is that something you do on your own, or how are you supported? Who supports you in this space?
Well, it's definitely not something I do on my own. Even though it's my classroom, I need buy-in from everybody. So everyone helps to support this work, knowingly and unknowingly. So when you recognize that there are inequities that exist in your classroom, because there are, but you have to also realize that these inequities exist beyond your classroom. That means they exist in the entire school, in the neighborhood, in the feeder pattern, the district, the city, the state, and beyond. And then therefore, you have to be more intentional about soliciting and harnessing the help of your stakeholders, because everybody is vested in the success of the kids. Like I said, the parents are not trying to send you their worst. They're sending you the best they got, and we've got to work with that. So you got to share your visions and your intentions with others. And even if they express disdain for your vision and intentions, keep sharing them, because sometimes opposition only exists because people don't understand what it is you're trying to do. So make them understand, or at least give them an opportunity to learn about your vision and your intentions. Invite your stakeholders to come into your classroom, witness the learning process and what your students are doing, and they can realize the difference that having an equitable classroom can make. So I never really shy away from an opportunity to tell people about, what's going on in my classroom, about my students and the learning opportunities. And so with sharing this, it provides an opportunity for me to get more supports and community partners, something I don't even know that existed before I started sharing our stories. So this helps to create a pipeline of support for other people, for me, particularly STEM professionals and organizations, businesses, other schools, universities. And those supports, once you establish that pipeline, they'll eventually start coming to you instead of you having to always go to them. So the support is everybody. It's everybody after all, and it has to be in order for it to truly be a success.
Oh, that's powerful. Bonnie, listen, you have convinced me. If you'll have me and I can make my way down to Huntsville, Alabama, I'd love to sit in on one of your classrooms because it sounds like you're doing a great job.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for what you're doing, and we appreciate it hearing your thoughts on the classroom perspective. I'd like to pivot for a second and go to Dr. Newman, Portia, because curriculum is another avenue to access. What are we putting in the classroom to help ensure equity? And so from your vantage point, how do you evaluate curriculum, video supplements? And I'm sure all material is not the best material, but how do you evaluate all of that for equity?
That's a really good question. There's multiple ways to go about that. I try to keep in mind a couple of things that help us just ground ourselves in direction. So considering things like people and characters, because representation matters, right? Who we see in text, who we see in videos, the voices, the skin tones on the characters, you name it. All that's important in allowing students to make the connection to the narratives, to the stories that they're seeing in the content. Content specifically, measuring kind of what is the knowledge, right? What are we trying to learn? And are the aspects of that content getting us to those outcomes? So you're looking at things that like, are there opportunities for critical thinking? And when I think about critical thinking, well, I'm really thinking about that intellectually disciplined process, right? Of learning, of skillfully conceptualizing or applying knowledge. And so how does that particular content or information get a student to that? And then, of course, thinking about the application of concepts. So how does this relate? Why does this matter, right? At 13 years old, what does this mean for my community? At 11 years old, what does it mean about the social groups or the things that I see outside the classroom walls? All of those things contribute to making sure that there's an equity lens on what's being taught and what's being learned. These components help me to respond to questions, right, about rigor, about data and sources, and about experiential learning. So if you are an educator, a school leader, or maybe even a community partner, really trying to be thoughtful about what learning looks like in the classroom, considering these components help us answer those questions. Like, is it rigorous for students? To Bonnie's point, are our teachers able to scaffold the information that is coming to those students? And then, of course, is it experiential? Does a student have to be from a particular region, having had a particular experience in their past? Is that necessary to understand the concept? And if not, how do they apply those concepts to their future thinking? When I think about equity in curriculum, I'm thinking about what it affords young people in terms of education, but also exposure and also experience. That's really important. And having that for whatever the student is really interested in.
I like that, exposure and experience, having access to that. I think is very important. Now, Portia, in this environment, you kind of touched on this earlier. This, unfortunately, DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging has become so polarizing. What should school administrators do, or what skills are necessary to prep teachers and how to execute or ensure, I should say, equity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going to say this in no particular order because I think it works differently depending on who's in your school building. But I'll start with really the foundational concepts, right? So you said it, diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging. We can actually run a vocabulary list of terminology that's been floating around. And so having just a baseline understanding of what those words mean is a great start, right? So if we're asking teachers to develop, build, and execute on equitable classrooms, they've got to really understand the concept of equity, right? If we're asking teachers to address learning for students with intersectional identities and thinking about inclusive learning spaces, they've got to be able to define those concepts for themselves. So to me, at the base, at the foundation, is really thinking about an awareness of those concepts, key terms. And I want to be thoughtful that this could be done through professional development. It could be done through training, and want to be thoughtful that is not the only way. But it also could be done with additional education opportunities. And these are the things that start to shift the culture in a building, right? Now, teachers are using different language to discuss opportunity for their students, to discuss changes in their classrooms that better support their students. Another way to kind of go about this is also really thinking about what are the administrative expectations of the folks in their building teaching. Right. I think we heard Bonnie say this too about this kind of standard of excellence, right? That it is possible for us all to create a learning space that works for all students, and it does require work. And I cannot go easy on the idea that administrators have a big influence on setting that expectation and culture for their teachers, and why it's so important. It's a great way to build relationships with students and families. It's a great opportunity to develop those partnerships outside of the school building that allow for teachers and students to have resources to advance their learning. Being sure that we're setting expectations that an equitable, inclusive learning space is important also means we're taking the next steps to make that happen. And the last thing that I'll add, oh, go ahead.
No,
I was gonna say
the
last quick piece I'll add there is just having a growth mindset and really thinking about how we use data to be a part of that approach, right? I can talk about growth mindset in the general speaking terms, but it can be uncomfortable, right? It means I've got to think positive. I got to think about opportunity, and doing so even when I'm at a point of discomfort. This is new language. These are new best practices. And so we're not going to get it right every time. But what I'm looking for is doing this work in partnership with administrators who are really thinking about how to support their teachers and getting them there. So having that data piece, I think, is really important because it helps you tell you where you have opportunity, where there might be gaps, where there's success, right? And how do we elevate that so that we can replicate that from one classroom to the next?
Wow. To that point, Portia, I understand that you've done some work with Project Lead the Way to develop a validation tool that allows you all to ensure inclusion and equity in the work that Project Leads the Way on the curriculum side of the house. So kudos to you for being a partner and working with an organization like Project Lead the Way to ensure equity in all that they do.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So Portia, thank you so much for your remarks. I'd like to bring in Sanal Bhakta. Sanal, again, thank you so much for joining us, and appreciate you for bringing up the rear, for lack of better terms, or being our last panelist with this specific question I have for you. So I know we've heard a lot of great things. We'd like to look at this now from a wider sort of district perspective. So from your vantage point, how does equity tie into standards for the state for middle school students?
Yeah. So in my opinion, standards are typically tied to factual knowledge, like vocabulary, or can a student demonstrate a skill set, right? And then it's assessed, right? Students will take an assessment based upon, hey, have they mastered the content? Have they mastered the standard? So when I think about equity, I'm going to take a little bit of a different viewpoint. I was like, do we really want equity a part of standards, right? Yeah. Because in my mind, I was like, do we really want, students to be 60% knowledgeable as it relates to equity, or just equity in general, as that it's a part of them? So really my point of view is standards or equity should be a part of a school's environment, a school's culture. That's kind of those unwritten standards. You walk into a school, you expect to see maybe tables and desks and chairs maybe modular tables and desks or chairs or something like that. But you kind of expect it almost like the air you breathe. So I think, equity really needs to tie into schools, and honestly, it has been, and it should have been, and even because of the pandemic, there's more awareness about it. But we've all known that equity should be a part of schools, but we've never written it down or said, okay, here's our focus. Here's how we're building. Here's how we're ensuring our culture, our climate is equitable to our students. All students have that necessary access or that opportunity. But, really looking at, hey, it's that air we should breathe. Do they have the necessary resources to be successful, and equity looks different in different areas, right? So to try to standardize it doesn't make sense in my mind, right? Whether it's an inner city school, whether it's a school with a high ELL population, multilingual population, single family parent, equity looks different. So I think, having it be just like the air we breathe is really what we should be focusing on.
You know what? I really appreciate that. I think about if I were to walk into any middle school across the country today, I'd probably see the word excellence, achievement.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Why not equity?
Exactly.
As a part of the normal culture of that particular building in that district.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes total sense. So from your vantage point, how can a district or building level administrators support the educators in this work?
Yeah, just like any organization, it's got to come from top down, right? So district level administrators, principals of schools, associate superintendents. I mean, we have to live and breathe equity. We have to be those role models, those examples for our schools, for our educators, for our principals, And first, it starts with, I'll use the term professional learning, right? Really providing opportunities, investing in our faculty, the people we work with, and not only just educators, right? Educators, counselors, support staff, people who are greeting people at the front desk, right? It cannot just be limited to the four walls of a classroom, right? It has to be the entire community really has to be supportive of it and really engaging those people. So as a leader, showing that, hey, we're making an investment. We're either providing, trainings, workshops, or better yet, we're providing opportunities for our staff to learn about equity, maybe to grow themselves. Because one thing, everyone comes from a different background, right? Everyone's perception of equity, everyone's idea of what equity should be is going to be different. And you know what? That is okay. But what we need to do is we need to come together and figure out, okay, equity for our students today looks different than it did yesterday, will look different than tomorrow. But for today, what is that going to look like for our school, whether it's in Alabama, whether it's here in Las Vegas, Nevada, whether it's in Florida? What does that look like, right? And what do we need to put in place? As a leader, what supports do I need to provide? Resources, training, just like you said, do we need to put a big sign that says equity next to excellence? Right? What needs to happen so that whenever anyone walks into that school building, that school environment, whether it's a student, a teacher, faculty, staff, parent, family member, caregiver, community person, business person, they understand that, hey, this is a safe space and this is a space where every voice can be heard. So I think really showing that leadership there is paramount in order for equity. Because if you don't have the buy-in from leadership, if leadership doesn't believe in equity, it's just going to make that much more challenging to ensure that we're really reaching and providing opportunities for every student.
So Sanoa, I thank you for what you just shared. I'd like to ask you a very personal and specific question, because you talked about this community, right? I just so happen to have two really great friends. One has become a principal in the state of Maryland. The other is running for a school board position in the state of, Virginia, both in Virginia.
Yeah.
What is your advice to me as someone who cares about learning, equity, but more in particular, their success and their leadership roles? How can I be a supporter of the work that they're potentially doing moving forward? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's that network, right? That network to be able to support them. I'll use the term troublemakers, right? Find those good troublemakers. Find those individuals that are really supportive of your efforts, right? And sometimes I think, we love to surround ourselves with people around us that think the same way. But I'll challenge you and say sometimes we need to surround ourselves with people that think completely opposite way. And the reason why is so that sometimes you get that reality check in conversations, in collaborations, and say, hey, I never thought about that idea, because everyone around me within my network, is supportive of equity, supportive of diversity, supportive of inclusion, right? So maybe bringing in someone who maybe has not really kind of done a lot as that in regards, but maybe they have other thoughts or viewpoints on maybe, hey, why are we struggling? Why do we have these challenges? I think collaboration is a key. One thing, my background is from the private sector. I've been in education now nearly 14 years. And when I was in the private sector, we always collaborated with other companies, other organizations. And when I came to education, whether you're a leader of a school district or a school or a board member, too often I find like, we try to put ourselves on an island, like we try to be our own heroes or our own champions, and not realizing like I'll quote Marvel, not realizing that Iron Man can't solve the day, but when you bring in the Hulk and Black Widow and all these Avengers together, that's when together they can solve the day. That's when they can overcome those challenges and issues, because each one has different strengths. Each one has different viewpoints, but together, working collectively, collaborating is when you can really truly make an impact for all students. And I constantly do that with Clark County School District here, reaching out to my peers in other school districts, in other business opportunity, in other business organizations, and to really get their feedback or input, because I always believe two minds are greater than one, three minds are greater than two, so on and so forth. And the more people you bring to the table, the more voices you bring, I think the better your solutions are going to be to solve some of these problems as it relates to equity in our middle school grades.
That's phenomenal. You just nailed diversity right there. The differences, perspective, ideas, dimensions of diversity, whether it's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, you name it. Leveraging all of that to ensure inclusion and equity is very important in this work. And we do that through collaborating. So Noah, before I let you go and we open it up, since you put it out there, and I just saw Avengers Endgame yesterday on the flight, I got to ask you, which Avenger would you be if you had to choose?
So it's interesting you say that, because my staff here have said that I'm Iron Man because I'm the tech guy, right? So basically I basically kind of flipped it on that. I was like, okay, so basically you're saying I have no special abilities. I'm just a tech guy here. So, but yeah, I mean Iron Man's probably the one that I most associate with, because I'm always trying to think of new ideas. Iron Man's thinking of new gadgets, new ways to do things. When I was in the private sector, I was a consultant, and one of the biggest things that got ingrained in my mind was continuous improvement, CI. So I try to bring that into education each and every day. It's like, how can we improve what we're doing, right? Just because education has been doing it this way for decades doesn't mean it's right, and doesn't mean we should continue to do it. Is there a way we can better engage students, better improve graduation rates, better be more equitable to all students, no matter what the situation is? So, but yeah, that'd probably be mine. So I have to ask you yours, Marlon. Do you have a favorite or one that you resonate well with as far as an Avenger?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say Iron Man, but in the spirit of diversity and not taking yours, I'd like to go. I'll go with Captain America. It's just something about his leadership style that just really resonates with me. So Iron Man first, but you said it, so then I'll go to Captain America.
That's great. Thank you. That's great. Yeah.
Listen, thank you for all you do. Clark County Schools are so fortunate to have you, and thank you for again being a collaborator. As I understand it, you're a part of the Project Lead the Way external advisory board. And so again, thank you for your leadership, both within your school district and nationally. So we appreciate you. So let's try to bring in the rest of our panelists. I know we have a few minutes left here, and I want to try to get to as many questions as I possibly can. So I see them in the Q&A tab. So again, not in the group chat, but if you have a question for any of our wonderful panelists, Dr. Catherine Kennedy, Bonnie Garrett, Dr. Portia Newman, Sanal Bhakta, add them in the Q&A tab. So I'm going to ask you all if you can provide us with a 30 to 45 second response. I'm going to go to the first question I see here. How do you get buy-in from parents in regards to equity strategies or topics that are covered in classes that may be controversial? As a former principal, this comes up often. So how do you get buy-ins from parents from things that might be equity topics that might be controversial? Would one of our panelists like to take that?
Sure. I'll chime in real quick. So, and I'll share this. So when working with parents, caregivers, community, whatever the situation is with the students, their family, home background, is I think having conversations with them, evenings, weekends, after school, involving food. And it sounds simple. It's like involving food to have these conversations. I was like, you know what? To have these conversations about equity with the people that can support these students when they're away from our schools, we have to be in a comfortable space. And I've always found that food, everyone's comfortable around food, right? Eating food, and I think really that's when you can have those conversations with parents. That's when you can have those, whether it's disagreement sometimes, or at least share, hey, here's the reason why we're doing this. Here's the reason why we're doing some of these equitable things in schools, different things like that. But I think that's the start. And then from there, you have to just kind of go with, the feedback and responses from there. But there's no one right strategy, but I would recommend try an evening, afternoon, Saturday event involving the parents, involving students, and then having those discussions and see where those discussions go from there.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. So now, Catherine, you have a perspective on this as well?
Yeah, I appreciate, Sanal, you bringing up the communication side and conversation piece. We have this program that we do, actually, Shamari Jones, who I mentioned during one of my answers, he talks about courageous conversations and when these conversations get difficult and where we come in. We might come in the emotion side of things, but like taking that step back and like really thinking about, okay, where is this person coming from as they're coming with this, idea that they don't really want to have this particular equity focused piece in, whether it's curriculum or an activity or an event. But I think actually giving everybody a space to share and then also taking the time to understand perspectives, but then also just engaging in those courageous, often very hard conversations to talk about, why it's important to incorporate equity into our spaces for psychological safety, for physical safety purposes, and then just ensuring that we're cultivating a space where voices and input can be heard. Because I think when people are included in the conversations, when they're heard and they can see that their contributions can and do affect change, that's where the whole school idea of equity and culture that has already been mentioned can actually happen.
That's great. Thank you, Catherine. Bonnie, I think we had a question specifically for you earlier. There's a question here that reads, do you think your mindset, growth versus fixed, impacted your thinking about your teaching style? Do you think your mindset impacted your thinking about your teaching style? Absolutely.
Like I said, once I pat myself on the back, I'm a pretty smart cookie here. But once I opened myself up to learning more about how to reach others, because it wasn't doing any good for me to know as much as I did and not be able to reach my students. And so once I was open to learning new strategies and learning to help them reach a growth mindset, because my students didn't have that. So once we started to kind of both jump onto, all of us, my kiddos and I, this growth mindset, it definitely helped, because it's okay not to know. and to evolve as you are learning. So yes, most definitely. Once I kind of transitioned from that fixed mindset to more of a growth mindset, that just kind of, like I said, opened the doors for me in regards to helping my kiddos, and it's awesome. It's been instrumental.
That's phenomenal. Thank you. Thank you for that, Bonnie. I've just been told the conversation has been so rich. So thank you to the panelists. Everyone has agreed to stay on for 5 minutes additional so we can get to as many questions as we can. So let me stop talking and continue the Q&A. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A tab. But I'm going to go to another question here. And thank you again to all of our panelists for your wonderful, wonderful insights today. Another question is, what should educators be mindful of when teaching ethnic studies? What should educators be mindful of when teaching ethnic studies? Any thoughts from our panelists?
I can maybe start here,
Sure.
particularly because of what we're seeing in the media around legislation, right? Around different types of studies. I think the first part is being aware of what's happening politically and how those topics are resonating in our lawmaking processes. So that's probably my first thought. And then second to that is also keeping in mind who you're teaching, right? So I love the fact that this warrants an opportunity for teachers to be really specific about exposing their students to more about who they are, but at the same time exposing them to the world around them. So I think really being able to make those connections to their community, their culture, their traditions, their history, and doing that in the greater context of our world is really important. So keeping in mind what's happening politically in your area, because I want folks to be thoughtful about that, but more importantly, thinking about it from an education and an experience and an exposure standpoint.
Thank you for that, Portia. Another question that popped up: how do you advocate for students when you are unsure of equitable initiatives? How do you advocate for students when you are unsure of equitable initiatives? So the way I kind of internalize that question is really defining what equity is, what are appropriate initiatives. Hopefully I'm getting the question right without calling, specific to the guest, but any thoughts there? How do you advocate for students when you're unsure of equitable initiatives? What's equity and what's not? Portia, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the first step to that too is getting really clear on what opportunity exists for your students. And we don't have to make that up, right? The data tells us what they're learning, how they're learning. If young folks are grappling with certain concepts in the learning, kind of what are those barriers to that? So getting really clear on that would also help with students. And then I'm gonna say very simply, let's ask our young people, right? What is it that you need to be most successful? What is the context for your world when you're learning the most, or can apply these concepts to your world? And so I think that it sounds like a simple question, but you don't necessarily have the answers. And I do believe that our young people are brilliant enough to be able to think through that. Their families as well. I taught pre-K for a little while, and I would always remember this idea that my teacher would tell me, and that parents want the best for their young people, right? They don't always know all the language and the words to advocate it, but they do want the best. And so asking them what would be helpful, what they need. And sometimes students will say, I need more time. Sometimes students will say, I need more resources. Sometimes students will be vocal and say, I'm actually not seeing myself in this, so I don't really care about it. And so that just prompts us to make different changes in what we're teaching and how we're teaching that to engage and be inclusive of their learning in those spaces.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Portia. Catherine, I know you want to jump in on that, and I'll let you chime in. I do want to get to one last question, Catherine, after your response. I think it's a really great question that sums up this entire conversation. So, Catherine, after your response, I'll go to our final question that's in the chat, and then we'll start the wrap-up process. So, Catherine, to you.
Okay, that sounds great. Dr. Portia, I think you nailed that one on the head in terms of really just asking what students want and what parents and caregivers think they should have as well for supports, because they know them the best oftentimes. So, you know, needs assessment, that type of thing. But I think back to something that Sanal also said, resource mapping, collaboration. I think when Sanal mentioned collaboration and like thinking about the different networks that you have, like what kind of resource mapping can you do with other organizations around that can help support and also already have these types of activities happening that pertain to equity.
That's great, Catherine. Thank you so much for that. So one last question, you all, and I love the thought here. The idea that equity should be in the air we breathe. However, to run this analogy, we need air quality standards. And indeed, quite literally, air quality in schools show up as equity being disproportionately something that impacts students of color. So what strategies do you all suggest to find a middle ground, right, that doesn't completely disconnect equity from standards, but also acknowledges the complexities of what equity looks like at the local level? So how do we balance the noise we hear in the poor air quality, but also do what we all know is most important, which is ensuring equity in our schools? And hopefully I did that question justice. Any thoughts from any of our panelists?
So let me kick it off. I mean, a ton of ways, a ton of information here, but let's think about this one thing. So when you're looking at that air quality for a school, right, the foundation of every school is the school schedule. If you think about it, right, the school schedule, the classes they offer, right? So as we're looking at students coming into that school, what classes are we offering? Are we offering higher level classes? Are we offering lower level classes? Are we offering mid-range classes? Are we offering, you know, all the various classes? Are we ensuring the classes we offer are aligning with the students coming in those doors? Or are we offering the classes based upon the adults and what they can teach, right? I had a conversation with the principal the other day, and I asked the principal, I was like, why do you offer so many honors classes? And the principal's in an inner city school. Why do you offer so many honors classes? Because students aren't being successful. And the principal was of the mindset of, well, since I'm in the inner city, they don't have access to these honors classes. So he tries to offer as many of those honor classes as possible. And I was like, well, let's take a step back. I was like, we want the students to be successful, right? There's certain standards, certain metrics that they need to meet, right? So what classes could we offer for them to be successful? And start thinking about, hey, you know, build the school around that. And the other thing is, with these classes, how many times have we walked into schools and they've taught these classes for years and years and years, but is it the same students walking in those doors each and every year? And I was like, that's a tremendous task to adjust your schedule, what education is teaching each and every year, and customizing it to education. So that's the air quality that we really need. We need to customize that air quality to every student every year that's walking into that classroom, and make changes and adjustments. So that's my thought on that.
That's very impactful, Sanal. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to add a sort of a thought as a closing remark?
Marlon, I would say to that question, particularly from a classroom perspective, for me, I hear pre-test, kind of see what they already know. And if they don't know it, then you got to kind of, like I said beforehand, meet them where they are. And if they do know it, move on to something else or scaffold it to another level for them. Like differentiated learning at its finest. So like I said, you got to know your kids, and you got to know what they know so that you're not, in essence, wasting their time with the mundane, but that you can challenge them to be even more successful by tapping into, like I said, what they already know and building on that. That's my take on it from a classroom perspective.
Yeah, no, and Bonnie hit it right on the nose. You have to know your students. I would suspect more schools in our country know what the teachers can teach versus what the students really need to be taught in the schools, right? Right, wow. Bonnie, if I'm correct, I love the way you said that.
Listen, I think that's a perfect end to our conversation today. So first of all, let me thank everyone who took the time to join in and listen to today's discussion. for your many questions. Within a week, you'll receive an email with the recording of this webinar and additional resources that may be able to support you. We'd really like to thank Ed Week and Project Lead the Way for hosting this webinar. If you'd like to learn more about Project Lead the Way, please visit their website at www.pltw.org. Then I also encourage you to contact and reach out and expand your networks with today's panelists and myself as a webinar. You'll see my information listed here, Dr. Marlon Moore. Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine Kennedy, Bonnie Garrett, Dr. Portia Newman, and Sanal Baka. You all have been a very informative, inspiring, and fun group to join in today's discussion. So I thank you all so much. Thank you for all you're doing to ensure classroom strategies and equity strategies that build student confidence. So with that, thank you so much. Everyone have a great day, have a week, and we'll see you along the journey. Be well, my friends. Bye-bye.